All right, in terms of tools and materials that we'll be using today, I'm just gonna run through those real quick in the order that we will be using them. And first up is a very simple garden hoe. We'll be using that to clear off the existing weeds and materials. Next up, bog standard shovel to remove the debris and the weeds. A good strong rake to just form up those beds and get everything mixed together. Some sort of measuring implement. I just have a stick that I have pre-measured out to 30 inches and 40 inches, which is what I use for all my beds. A garden fork right here, which is what we're gonna use to actually loosen up that soil. Some organic fertilizer just to bring a little bit of nutrients back into our inert soil. Seeds, I'm using cover crops, a cover crop mix specifically, but you just need something to plant into the beds that you prepare today. Oh, and some compost manure mix, which I forgot to bring over here, but you'll see it in a second. I've got some irrigation tubing. This is just 6-inch emitter tubing, whatever you prefer to use for your irrigation. And then I will be keeping all of the tubing in place with some bog standard garden stakes, and that's it. And I also want to say, this is a really low-tech, easy project. Don't feel like you need to run out and buy any of the materials I just talked about. You absolutely can. I have gotten very similar results just using the garden hoe, some manure. You can just take chicken manure if that's what you've got on hand or whatever, and some sort of seeds or seedlings to plant into that area. Those 3 alone are gonna get you a really, really good bed. To start, I'm just gonna remove anything growing in place right here and any of the debris across the entire space that I wanna garden in. So not just the beds themselves, but the pathways in between, the whole area. We did have this area mulched up with wood chips pretty good, but unfortunately, over the last year, Bermuda grass, crabgrass, burr clover, all sorts of nasty stuff came in. So I'm just raking off the chips and clearing the soil with a hoe. And I'm gonna go ahead and remove the debris we've created and put it somewhere useful. In other words, I'm gonna put it in with the chickens where they can poop on it and turn it into compost for next year. All right, let's just take a quick inventory of the soil that we cleared up here. First thing I'm noticing is that it is very, very compact, and that's to be expected. This area has been a lawn for probably decades, but that's something to contend with. We do have a little bit of organic material here at the very, very top, just from the wood chips deteriorating over the last year or so that's kind of nice. Fortunately, I haven't really seen any earthworms. We've done a few beds at this point, and I haven't seen a single worm. And that kind of tells me that there's just not a lot of life going on in this area yet, and so that's really my goal. We are dealing with some really good-sized roots in this area just because there's an ash tree at the end of the bed. I do recommend kind of just sitting down with the soil and kind of checking it out and see how it's doing. It'll give you a better idea of what you need to work on the most. This is the point in the story where you sort of have a few options. At this point, a lot of folks are going to want to lay down a cardboard layer all over the beds, just standard box cardboard like this, and then pile on top of it lots of organic manure and compost, and then over the next couple seasons, either with plants or without plants, that area is going to break down and ideally become a good vegetable bed. I don't really love the results when I have tried this just because it doesn't do enough to actively decompact our very, very tough clay soil, so not my favorite option. Another option, which I like a little bit better, is the lasagna bed method, where you still do the carbonaceous material layer, but then on top of it, you do a nitrogen layer, like these weeds that I just picked here, and then you do another carbon layer and then another nitrogen layer, and depending how many layers you want to do in your particular lasagna. I like that better just because it naturally builds up the soil, which creates a fluffier layer with good structure I can grow into, but it's a lot of faffing about, it's a lot of work, so again, not my favorite. Third, and probably the most effective if you have really noxious weeds that you're dealing with, if you know that you're really going to struggle with weeds next season, out competing your veggie garden, you can actually lay down an artificial material, a plastic tarp, a silage tarp, depending on what you have access to, and let it sit for a given period of time. You can look up occultation or solarization if you want to learn more about that, and that's really good at getting rid of those nasty, nasty weeds. I personally am not going to do any of those. I'm going to skip right to the bed prep using the garden fork, and I can do that because I've gardened in this area for a little while and I know that the weed pressure isn't going to be that unmanageable. If your soil is really dry, you're going to want to either wait for a rainstorm or wet it down thoroughly with a hose. Basically, when the soil is really, really dry, it's just too hard to work, and if it's really, really wet, then after you try and decompact it, it's just going to recompact right away again. So you want it to be moist from a good rain, but not muddy. And on a completely unrelated note, if you are enjoying this video, if you do think it's going to prove helpful in setting up your garden, I'd really appreciate it if you could quickly hit the like button. And of course, if this is the kind of stuff that you like watching, go ahead and subscribe. We'd love to have you as a member of the community. We've got lots more videos planned. I think some really fun stuff. Otherwise, let's go ahead and get back to setting up these veggie beds. All right, so what I'm doing now is actually measuring out the beds and the pathways in between the beds. I'm doing a mixture of 40-inch wide beds with about 12-inch pathways and 30-inch beds with 12-inch pathways. 40-inch beds with a 12-inch pathway, really efficient in terms of maximizing the amount of space that I'm gonna get out of this area, but it's also kind of pain in the butt to deal with. It just doesn't leave you a lot of room to maneuver, and a 40-inch bed is very big. A 30-inch bed with an 18-inch pathway is gonna be more common, but of course that just leaves a lot more space for walking and less space for growing in. So kind of just up to you what you wanna prioritize. Whatever you choose, just measure and demarcate out the beds like I'm doing here. In terms of the direction of the bed, I'm just orienting mine in the same direction as the slope rather than across the slope in this area, just to minimize damage from winter rainstorms, which is something that I learned last year in our main garden. Okay, next up, I'm going to be using my garden fork right here in this area to loosen up the soil. Our native soil, particularly in these areas that used to be a lawn, is too compact to grow vegetables in. I've tried. It really doesn't work. You could of course use a broad fork for this instead, but a garden fork is much cheaper. And of course, it maybe goes without saying, but only use tools that you feel comfortable with and that you can use safely. There is always the risk of injury using anything like this, so make sure that you are putting safety first. All right, so all I'm doing here with the fork is gently creating some separation and some aeration by pushing the fork in and then lifting up a little bit. I'm not actually turning the soil significantly, and this part is definitely the longest and the most difficult step, but I am trying to be extra careful personally because I want to minimize harm to those ash tree roots I talked about in this area. Also, remember, the most important thing is you need to be 100% sure there's no danger of hitting any utility or irrigation lines in this area. So in my area of the United States, I can just call 811, which we have done, and they will come out and mark any lines. Just basically make sure you're doing your own due diligence. You want to be careful. I have seen this go wrong. I wasn't very aggressive with my garden fork in this area, so this soil, it is still probably a little bit too compact to grow a good garden in. Veggies would grow here, they would just be stunted, and I can 100% promise you that is the case. Vegetables do not grow well in compact soil. Their roots, they need to be able to penetrate down and they need to be able to penetrate out, and that's just not possible when the soil is this tough, when it's this dense. So if you are watching this video and it's end of spring, you're under a time crunch, you want to get your garden into the ground, but your soil after that forking is still a little bit too compact, you basically have two options. One, you can just plant into deep planting holes, intermixed with lots of compost or aged manure, and I'll link to a video on exactly how we do that. It is very effective. Or you can just undergo a one-time mechanical power tilling, right? You can really work that soil in with a lot of organics like compost and aged manure. And then from that point on, you can move to more of a no-till or low-till or no-dig, whatever you're interested in. Just know that it's not some moral failing to have to till your garden once. Luckily, we've got enough time to let the magic of cover crops kind of continue the work that we started today in decompacting the soil over time, and that way I don't have to bring in a rototiller and really shred up all these roots, which again is just something I want to avoid. Now I'm going to add some organic fertilizer, as a lot of these cover crops do need supplemental nutrition, and I know from experience this soil is pretty inert at this point. There's not a lot going in there. Basically the same reason why I didn't just plant the cover crops in and skip the forking process entirely. Even the cover crops can't grow into completely compacted clay soil. I've tried growing cover crops into this. It really truly does not work. It is now time to add the magic ingredient, cover crops. Basically, these cover crops are going to not only keep the soil loose, the work that we did today, they're going to continue that work of further decompacting the soil. They're also going to help inject nutrients into the soil, which is going to bring life back into this area. In combination with compost and water and just good husbandry in general of this area, I pretty much guarantee come spring, you are going to see tons of worms and lots of good micro and macro organisms that are just going to make this a much more productive area to grow food in. Fair warning, if you decide to use cover crops as well, you really need to have a plan on how you are going to kill off those cover crops when it comes time to plant your vegetable garden. I'm using a cover crop mix, mostly just because it was very cheap. And I know from experience that done incorrectly, it can actually just basically result in weeds, just different kinds of weeds. So do your research on the cover crops that are going to make sense for the time of year you're planting in, your local climate, what your soil needs. There's lots of factors there, but just have a plan. I now know that basically come spring, when it's time for me to terminate these cover crops, I can cut them down low at the soil level, and then I can lightly cultivate the top inch of soil, and that'll just get rid of anything that survived that initial culling. And then I can add a really deep layer of compost mulch. And at that point, I'm pretty much going to be able to kill off all of the cover crops. That works well for me. Just make sure that you have a plan in place for your beds. Now I'm seeding my cover crop mix on right at this point because I'm only going to be adding a relatively thin layer of compost and manure, and that's just because I'm low on compost right now. If I had more compost, I would do a thick layer and then plant the cover crops in after that with the cover crop seeds in place. Just gonna lightly rake them in here and press them down a little bit. If you don't rake them in, your seeds aren't gonna have enough contact with the soil, and you're gonna get a really bad germination rate and basically just waste your money on seeds that never sprout. Okay, next up, I'm going to add about an inch of compost and aged manure onto the bed. I'll say that if I was planting in the short term, if I was gonna be growing veggie crops here within the next month, I would add a much, much thicker layer. But because I have the next 5 months to really build up these beds using the cover crops and then adding more compost in the spring, I feel like I can get away with a little bit less. But know that if you want to add a thicker layer, you're basically only going to benefit from doing so. All right, now I'm just raking it all in a little bit right now, getting the lines clean, but also I'm trying to leave the top layer as compost and mulch. The dark color just helps warm up the sun, which is really nice in fall and winter here. But I do also want to try and get a little bit of intermingling between the native soil that we just forked up and the compost and the manure that I'm adding here on top. All right, this bed looks pretty good. Let's go ahead and water it all in. I'm watering with the hose pretty aggressively here because I think the pressure from the water helps ensure contact between all these cover crop seeds that you can see and the soil. Keep in mind, even if the top layer looks really saturated, doesn't actually mean the water has penetrated down into the native soil. It can actually take a while to make sure that it gets down more than, a 1/4 inch, and we really want it to get all the way down to the seeds there. Next up, and really last up, we're nearing the end here, I'm just gonna lay out some irrigation, and that's definitely something I recommend you do as well if you're comfortable with it. Irrigation is very annoying to install, but it's also very important because we don't want these beds that we have basically made ripe for life to grow in. We don't want to let them dry out and push back our progress. This year, I've moved over to using these emitter tubes. Basically, these are just long lines of irrigation tubing where every 6 inches or 12 inches, depending on the style that you buy, there's a pre-drilled emitter hole, and that lets out a predetermined amount of water per hour. I just find them very affordable, easy to install. Maybe more importantly, they're very efficient and very predictable. So I'm running 2 lines of irrigation tubing per bed, 30 inch and the 40 inch, and I'm just using simple little garden stakes here to pin the lines at the end of each row. It can be tempting as you're doing this to kind of give up and let the beds dry out when we don't have veggies growing in them and it's just cover crops or there's bare, but you really want to keep that soil life happy. Good soil does dry out and die, unfortunately. At this point, I'm just gonna keep these cover crops growing. In spring, I will terminate them and I will just fork up the soil a little bit again, just decompact it again. I will add a nice thick layer of compost, again, probably more like 3 to 5 inches. Now, at this point, if you don't suffer from a lot of weed pressure, 1, I envy you, and 2, it's probably a nice time to go ahead and add a mulch like wood chips into the pathways between your rows. I would be adding wood chip mulch here now, except for the next 6 to 9 months, I really need to leave the pathways bare to make them easier to weed. And then after I've really reduced the weed pressure in this area, at that point, I'll be able to lay down that wood chip mulch, which is really gonna bring this garden to the next level. I just wanna say that there are lots of very good ways to prepare a garden, lots of good ways to garden. And I would advise you, and this is advice that's really helped me, to try and avoid the zealotry that can sometimes be associated with any given style of gardening, whether that's back to Eden or intensive or double dig or low till or no dig, whatever it is, those are all useful systems. They're useful structures, but they're not useful labels in your garden. So please feel free to experiment. Please feel free to choose an option, choose a style that is going to work for your physical health, what you can manage in the garden, that's going to work for your budget, and that's going to work for your timeline.